Scotland versus England, how Scotland defeated England. The Edinburgh Castle night raid. In the dead of night, under a moonless sky in the year 1314, the fate of a nation hung by a thread. Thomas Randolph, the young and cunning Earl of Moray, stood at the base of Edinburgh Castle with a handful of brave warriors by his side. Their mission, nothing less than legendary. A bold and dangerous night raid to reclaim one of the last English-held strongholds in Scotland. Edinburgh Castle, perched high on a rocky crag, seemed impossible to breach. But Randolph had a secret. Knowledge of a narrow, hidden path up the rock face, known only to a few. With silent determination, his men began the perilous climb, their armor muffled, their hearts pounding. Above them, the English garrison slept, unaware that history was about to change. This wasn't just a castle, it was a symbol of foreign rule and of the long, bloody struggle between Scotland and England. The recapture of Edinburgh Castle marked a turning point in the epic battles for Scottish independence. With the fall of this fortress, only one English stronghold remained in all of Scotland. The tide was turning, and as dawn broke, the saltire flew high once more over Edinburgh's ancient stones. The War of Independence was racing toward its legendary climax, and Scotland's fight for freedom was far from over. The death of King Alexander. It was a bleak and stormy day in March 1286, a day that would change the future of Scotland forever. King Alexander III, ruler of the Scots, convened what would unknowingly be his final council meeting. They gathered in the Castle of the Maidens, high above the city of Edinburgh, surrounded by wind and rain. Little of real importance was discussed that day, and yet the weight of history loomed just beyond the storm. Against the advice of his companions and the fury of the weather, Alexander insisted on crossing the Firth of Forth to be with his young queen in Kinghorn. He reached the other side, safely crossing by the Queen's Ferry, but in the dark, rain-swept night, he was somehow separated from his escorts. By morning, his lifeless body was found on the shore, his neck broken after a fall from his horse. With his sudden death, Scotland was thrown into uncertainty. There was no clear heir, no king, no plan, and into that power vacuum stepped ambition, betrayal, and foreign interference. What followed was nearly 3 decades of chaos, bloodshed, and a rising call for freedom that would echo across the land. And 28 years later, that storm would find its violent conclusion at the banks of a small muddy stream beneath Stirling Castle, a place that would forever be remembered in Scottish history, the Bannockburn. When King Alexander III died in 1286, Scotland was left in turmoil. The king had no sons to inherit the throne. His only heir was his granddaughter, a young Norwegian princess, but her life was tragically cut short when she died in Orkney just 4 years later. With no direct heir, Scotland now faced the grim reality of a succession crisis. The nation was on the brink of civil war, as various claimants to the throne, some with stronger legal rights than others, fought for their place. The kingdom was fragile, and the Scots feared the consequences of a civil war that could tear the country apart. In an attempt to prevent chaos, the regents who were left in charge turned to Edward I, King of England. They asked him to act as an impartial judge and decide which of the contenders was most deserving of the throne. Edward, ever the opportunist, was more than willing to oblige. He had once been the brother-in-law of Alexander III, and he saw this as a perfect chance to increase his influence over Scotland. But Edward had a price. In return for his decision, he insisted that the Scots formally recognize him as Scotland's overlord, effectively making him the king's superior. The stage was set for a dangerous and unpredictable series of events. Scotland's future was now in the hands of a foreign king, and the seeds of resistance were sown. Edward's claims and John Balliol. All of the claimants to the Scottish throne were men of Norman-French descent with ties to the old Celtic aristocracy. These claimants were not just Scottish nobles, they also held lands in England. 3 of them had even fought for Edward's father, King Henry III, at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. Because of these connections, Edward I had a strong argument. He claimed that since many of these men were already his subjects, he had the right to treat Scotland as a part of England, rather than as an independent kingdom. His argument seemed logical, and with the country in turmoil, the guardians of Scotland had little choice but to accept his decision. Over the next 18 months, the original 13 claimants were narrowed down to 2 final contenders, John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, and Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. The nobility, eager for stability, rallied behind Balliol, and in 1292 he was crowned King John of Scotland. But his reign would be anything but peaceful. John Balliol's position as king was weakened from the start by Edward's interference. Although he was officially the ruler of Scotland, Edward I made it clear that his influence over the Scottish throne would be absolute, leading to years of conflict and resistance. Historical sources. Of course, Bannockburn happened a long time ago, but we do have some valuable sources that have survived the centuries. Two, in particular, stand out for their importance. One of the key sources is the Laner Cost Chronicle, written by an Augustinian friar near Carlisle. This chronicle provides a vivid account of the events, told from the English perspective. The friar was an eyewitness to many of the battles and events he described, and he often references conversations with those who were there. His perspective offers a unique insight into how the English viewed the struggle for Scottish independence. On the Scottish side, probably the most important source is the Bruce, a long poem written by the monk John Barber from Aberdeen. This metrical account of the Wars of Independence focuses on the life and achievements of Robert the Bruce. Barber also skillfully weaves in numerous stories about the Douglas family, who were key players in the struggle. This source not only recounts historical events, but also offers a sense of how the Scots viewed their fight for freedom. Both sources, although different in tone and perspective, give us a clearer picture of one of the most important moments in Scottish history: the breaking of peace. At first, things seemed to be progressing smoothly, and Edward's overlordship over Scotland appeared secure. However, in 1294, Edward made a bold demand. He ordered King John Balliol to raise an army and send troops to fight for English interests in France. This demand was met with strong resistance. Both Edward's own English vassals and the Scots refused to comply. The Scots argued that while the king had the right to call upon men for the defense of Scotland, he had no authority to send them to fight abroad. Though the issue at hand wasn't strictly about sovereignty, it quickly became one. The Scots under King John transformed what was a dispute over military service into a matter of national independence. In a dramatic move, King John of Scotland, once subservient to Edward, signed an alliance with France. He also sent Scottish troops to raid the northern regions of England. This act, in Edward's eyes, was a direct challenge to his authority. The fragile peace between the two nations was shattered, and Scotland's path to independence began to take a more defined and aggressive direction. Edward's vengeance. Edward was furious, and his response was brutal. In 1296, over the course of 17 bloody days, he launched a merciless campaign against the Scots. He stormed the town of Berwick, a key Scottish stronghold, and sacked it completely. The Scottish army was decisively defeated at the Battle of Dunbar, and King John, humiliated and broken, was forced to beg for peace. Edward did not treat the Scots as legitimate enemies. Instead, he saw them as mere rebels, deserving of no mercy. His actions were ruthless, and he subjected the Scots to harsh reprisals. The brutal treatment of the Scottish people during this campaign fueled resentment and anger, deepening the rift between the two nations. Edward's vengeance wasn't just about military victories, it was about sending a message. He wanted to break the spirit of the Scots and reassert his dominance over the kingdom. But instead, his cruelty only fanned the flames of rebellion and resistance, sowing the seeds for the fierce struggle for independence that would follow. William Wallace rises. The following year, the Scots launched a national uprising. Sir Andrew Murray raised the northern forces and, moving south, joined with another Scottish army led by a legendary and fearsome warrior, William Wallace. Together, they gathered an impressive force determined to strike back against Edward's tyranny. On September 11, 1297, the combined Scottish army achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The English forces, caught by surprise, were routed. The Laner Cost Chronicle recorded the horror of the English soldiers, recounting how the Scots allowed as many of the English to cross the bridge as they could manage to overcome. Once the bridge was fully occupied, the Scots blocked it and slaughtered all those who had crossed. This victory at Stirling Bridge became a symbol of hope for the Scots, and a moment of immense pride. Wallace's leadership had inspired a nation, and for a brief moment it seemed that Scotland's fight for independence had found a powerful champion. Robert Bruce emerges. Unfortunately for the Scots, Sir Andrew Murray was fatally wounded during the battle at Stirling. However, William Wallace continued to lead the fight, harrying the north of England with his guerrilla tactics. Edward, determined to crush the rebellion, struck back fiercely and decisively. In July 1298, the English army dealt a crushing blow to the Scots at the Battle of Falkirk. After Falkirk, The conflict evolved into a brutal guerrilla war, with atrocities committed by both sides. The English forces rampaged through Scotland, while Wallace and his men used hit-and-run tactics to strike fear into their invaders. In 1305, Wallace was captured, betrayed, and executed in a brutal manner. His death marked a significant blow to the Scottish cause, but by then, a new leader had emerged. Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, grandson of the earlier Robert the Bruce, who had failed in his bid for the crown in 1291, now rose to prominence. Bruce's claim to the throne and his determination to fight for Scotland's independence would set the stage for the next chapter in the epic struggle. Bruce's path to the throne. Although both men share the same name, the grandfather and grandson are seldom confused. The man who would become Scotland's greatest warrior king is known to history simply as the Bruce. However, his loyalties were not always so clear-cut. In 1297, Bruce fought in the Scottish cause alongside Andrew Murray and William Wallace at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. But, as was common in the shifting allegiances of the medieval world, Bruce's loyalty was not fixed. In a surprising turn of events, he switched sides and fought for the English under King Edward at the Battle of Falkirk the following year. This move confused many, as Bruce's actions seemed to contradict his previous support for Scotland's independence. However, as time would show, this early wavering was part of a larger strategy. Bruce's complex path to the throne would be marked by political maneuvering, alliances, and personal ambition, all of which would ultimately lead him to claim his place as the true King of Scotland. The murder of John Comyn. At the beginning of 1306, Bruce changed sides for the last time. The vacant throne of Scotland had become his overriding ambition. In a brutal and decisive move to eliminate his remaining rival, he murdered John Comyn, the man most likely to stand in his way for the throne of Scotland. The feud between Bruce and Comyn had grown so intense that both men believed the only place where they could meet without immediate danger was in a church. Ironically, it was within the sacred walls of the church that Bruce drew his dagger and murdered Comyn in cold blood. This act of violence led to Bruce's excommunication by the church, a serious blow for any medieval ruler. Despite this, he pressed on with his claim to the throne. On Palm Sunday 1306, Robert Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone, marking the beginning of his official reign, though the path ahead would be anything but smooth. Edward I versus Edward II. Edward I was a difficult man to follow. Not only was he an experienced soldier, famously known as the Hammer of the Scots, but he was also a brilliant statesman. His reign had been marked by military successes and political savvy, making him a formidable king. But his son, Edward II, was a very different character. Edward II has received a great deal of criticism, both in his own time and in the years that followed. This negative reputation, however, is not entirely fair. While it's true that Edward had his favorites, and his personal life has been widely questioned, he was also an enlightened king. He had a deep appreciation for art, music, and culture, making him a patron of the arts in a way that was rare for monarchs of the time. In many respects, Edward II was ahead of his time. However, the problem was that he lacked the toughness and resolve necessary to rule effectively in a century dominated by fierce military and political struggles. While his reign was fraught with challenges, his legacy is more complex than simply being the weak king history often portrays him to be. The road to Bannockburn. By the summer of 1314, Bruce was no longer a hunted fugitive but the undisputed King of Scots. One by one, the towns and castles of Scotland had fallen or opened their gates to his forces. Now only one stronghold remained in English hands, and it was the most important one: Stirling Castle, the key to the kingdom. While not as large as Edinburgh Castle, Stirling held far greater strategic value. Situated in the heart of Scotland, it dominated the central plain, where most of the population and wealth of the country were concentrated. Controlling Stirling was vital for anyone who wanted to hold Scotland. Bruce knew that the battle for independence would be decided here, in the shadow of this formidable fortress. Edward II's army assembles. King Edward II was determined to relieve the beleaguered English garrison at Stirling Castle. Following in his father's footsteps, he gathered an army and marched north in the pivotal year of 1314. News had reached him that the governor of Stirling Castle, Sir Philip Mowbray, had agreed to surrender the castle to the Scots, if not relieved by Midsummer's Day. This added urgency to Edward II's mission. His march was no longer just a show of strength. It had become a race against time. The English king knew that the outcome of this campaign could determine not only the fate of Stirling Castle but also the future of English rule in Scotland. The pressure was mounting, and both sides understood that the coming battle would be decisive. The English forces. King Edward's army at Bannockburn was assembled through various means. At its core were his household knights, a dedicated force of armored cavalrymen permanently employed by the king. In total, Edward's army included around 3,000 heavy cavalry. These knights were equipped with iron helmets and mail coats, often reinforced with different types of plate armor for additional protection. Alongside the cavalry, Edward also mustered 20,000 infantrymen. Many of these soldiers came from the Welsh marches, while additional support was sought from Ireland. The Irish Prince of Ulster was asked to supply spearmen to bolster the English ranks. With this diverse force, Edward hoped to crush the Scottish resistance and reclaim control of the kingdom once and for all. The Scottish forces. The Scots army was raised in a similar manner to the English, but in one crucial respect, it was very different. The most important component of the Scottish army was not mounted knights, but the infantry. The Scots infantry were primarily armed with long pikes, a weapon that would prove to be crucial in the upcoming battle. Unlike the English foot soldiers, who relied mainly on the bill and the bow, the Scots employed large formations of pikemen known as schiltrons. This Scots term literally means moving thickets, and refers to the dense circular formations of soldiers, each armed with long pikes designed to fend off cavalry attacks. Each schiltron was made up of around 3,000 men, creating a formidable obstacle to any opposing cavalry force. Bruce chooses his ground. Unlike William Wallace, who had been forced to improvise his battlefield strategy, Bruce carefully chose his ground. Stirling was surrounded by a low floodplain, or carse, an area of wet marsh unsuitable for cavalry. However, a few miles south of Stirling, the old Roman road ran along a ridge of slightly higher, drier ground. It was clear that King Edward would attempt to advance on Stirling using this road. Bruce, however, was prepared. He deployed his army in the New Park, a wooded area just north of the ford over the Bannockburn. To slow down the English cavalry, Bruce ordered that pits and trenches be dug across the front of his position. These obstacles would force the English cavalry to navigate through treacherous terrain before they could even make contact with the Scottish infantry. Bruce had set the stage for a tactical ambush, hoping to turn the advantage in favor of his forces. The first clashes. On Sunday, the 23rd of June, the English army moved cautiously toward the Bannockburn. Halting about half a mile south of the stream, Edward, wary of any traps, decided to send 2 squadrons of cavalry ahead to scout the area and assess the defenses of the Scots. The first English reconnaissance party, led by Sir Henry de Bohun, advanced along the Roman road, splashed across the ford over the Bannockburn, and took note of the Scottish position. Then, in a moment of unexpected confrontation, they encountered Bruce himself. Young Sir Henry de Bohun, eager to prove himself, immediately spurred his horse and charged at Bruce, lance poised for the strike, but Bruce was ready. He calmly waited until the English knight was nearly upon him, then swiftly sidestepped on his nimble pony. In one swift motion, Bruce delivered a crushing blow with his battle-axe, striking down de Bohun as he passed. The clash, brief but dramatic, set the tone for the battle to come, signaling that Bruce was not only a skilled tactician, but also a fierce warrior who would not be intimidated. The night march. That night, the entire English army moved slowly and clumsily, swinging around to the right. They struggled across the Bannockburn, heading east of the New Park, and then took up a position, waiting uneasily for the first light of dawn. Already, the operation was beginning to go awry. Not only were the soldiers standing knee-deep in mud and water, but they also found themselves trapped. A large river lay at their backs, and another stream ran along their flank, effectively blocking any retreat. The English army had unwittingly marched straight into a well-laid trap, with Bruce and his forces lying in wait, ready to strike. Battle positions. Bruce was quick to notice the English movements, and as they struggled in the mud, he acted swiftly. He turned his own army and formed 3 schiltrons into a line, ready to face the English at dawn. His brother Sir Edward Bruce commanded the schiltron on the right, with the Earl of Moray's schiltron in the center and Sir James Douglas's schiltron on the left. The king's own schiltron was held in reserve, ready to support wherever needed. The Scots had now prepared themselves for the decisive moment. The battle was set to unfold, and Bruce's strategic positioning would prove to be critical. The battle begins. Around midday, one of Cumberland's staff officers rode forward and was immediately fired upon. The government artillery responded, and the battle had officially begun. As the 2 armies drew closer to each other, the Scots fell to their knees in prayer, seeking divine aid before the impending clash. They commended themselves to God, asking for strength and guidance in the coming fight. Once their prayers were finished, the Scots rose and with unwavering resolve, advanced boldly toward the English forces, ready to face the moment of truth. The Highland Charge. Instead of waiting passively on the defensive, Bruce took the initiative. He formed his schiltrons into columns and began the battle by advancing them down the gentle slope toward the English. As the battle raged, the Scots schiltrons advanced against the English cavalry, pushing forward relentlessly. Time and time again, the English cavalry charged bravely, but were met with the unyielding wall of Scottish pikes. No matter how hard they tried, the English knights could not break through the Scottish lines. The Scots held their ground, focused on one key goal, killing the horses. As each armored knight was thrown from his mount and struggled to free himself from his dying horse, he was quickly finished off with swords or axes. The English cavalry, once a fearsome force, was steadily dismantled. The artillery duel. Behind the embattled knights, the English infantry initially stood by, unable to join the fight. From time to time, English archers attempted to help by shooting arrows over the heads of the knights, hoping to strike the Scots pikemen who were packed tightly together. However, their efforts often backfired, as they ended up hitting many of their own men in the back. Realizing this, the archers were soon ordered to cease fire. With the infantry out of the fight and the cavalry in disarray, the struggle was left to the relentless clash of pikes. The Scots' well-coordinated defense held firm, as the English forces began to lose momentum. The turning point. As the battle raged, a new threat emerged. A group of archers, led by professional soldiers, moved to the right of the English line, staying well clear of the melee. From this advantageous position, they were able to target the exposed flank of Bruce's schiltron without the risk of hitting their own men. As the casualties among the Scots pikemen increased, Bruce decided to act. He called upon his cavalry. With 500 light horsemen, not heavily armored knights but fast-moving cavalry, Bruce launched a counterattack. Sir Robert Keith led the charge, and it was a complete success. The archers, who had posed a serious threat to the Scots' flank, were quickly scattered and cut down. The danger was eliminated, and the Scots' position was strengthened. The final push. The battle had been raging for an hour, and Bruce could see that his men were starting to tire. However, being a skilled general, he had reserved his final force for just this moment. Suddenly, Highland clansmen appeared on the top of Coxet Hill in the new park. Their arrival was a game-changer. As the clansmen emerged above the battlefield, Bruce shouted to his troops to push forward. The Scots, reinvigorated by this timely reinforcement, launched a final, decisive push. The momentum shifted, and the English lines began to break under the pressure. The end of the battle was drawing near. The rout. As the Scots' reinforcements flooded the battlefield, the English knights were filled with dread. What had been a battle of attrition suddenly turned into a rout. The foot soldiers, with their pikes, pushed the knights back, forcing them deeper into the swampy ground. Panic began to spread through the English ranks. Not all knights fled, however. Sir Giles d'Argenton, an old crusader, fought his way through the chaos to reach King Edward's side. He helped the king escape the battlefield into safety. But in a final act of courage, Sir Giles declared that he was not one to run from battle. He turned back to face the fight, knowing full well that it would mean certain death. Victory and pursuit. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, had secured a decisive victory. But the battle was far from over. As the defeated English soldiers fled back towards the Bannockburn, many were cut down in their desperate attempt to escape. The corpses piled up so thickly that it was said one could walk across them without getting their feet wet. The pursuit continued relentlessly, with Bruce's men chasing the English soldiers well into the night. The long summer day meant that darkness did not fall until very late, allowing the Scots to press on until they had almost wiped out the fleeing English. The significance of Bannockburn. Bannockburn was a turning point in the war for Scottish independence, and Bruce's victory can be attributed to several key factors. First, Bruce chose his battlefield wisely. The marshy ground was ideal for his pikemen, allowing them to form their schiltrons and defend against the heavier English cavalry, which struggled in the mud. Second, despite being heavily outnumbered by the English army, Bruce's forces were better trained and more disciplined. King Edward's knights, though brave, lacked coordination and discipline, which ultimately turned their superior numbers into a disadvantage. Additionally, the English side lacked a cohesive chain of command, which made it difficult for them to execute any strategic response. Bruce, on the other hand, was able to maintain control of his forces and, most importantly, knew when to commit his reserves to tip the scales in his favor. His ability to adapt to the battlefield was a crucial factor in securing the victory. The Declaration of Arbroath. King Edward I had long considered the King of Scots to be his vassal, a belief grounded in feudal law. However, the Wars of Independence changed that perception. After years of conflict, the Scottish people had demonstrated their determination to remain free from English rule. This resolve was most famously articulated in the Declaration of Arbroath, a document signed in 1320, 6 years after Bannockburn. The declaration made it clear that if King Robert the Bruce failed his people, they would reject him and choose another monarch to lead them. It boldly declared that as long as there were 100 men alive, the Scots would never submit to English domination. The declaration also made it clear that their fight was not about wealth, honor, or glory, but solely for liberty, a liberty that no man of honor would ever surrender except at the cost of his life. If you found this story of Scotland's fight for independence inspiring, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to discover more epic tales from British history. Share this video with anyone who loves stories of courage and determination.